advisor, mostly in silviculture and planning roles, with an emphasis on creating innovative solutions to forestry problems brought on by his focus in deciduous management. Neil is now the Forestry Program Director for Ecotrust Canada, where he's working on creating new business model for forest management and coastal ecosystems, which is driven by a value proposition rather than maximizing the timber volume harvested. A major focus is in integrating ecological goods and services into mainstream forest management, and as such, the role of forest carbon is a critical step. Ecotrust Canada has modeled timber and carbon flows in an effort to find an optimized business scenario to meet multiple objectives on both private timberlands and Crown TFLs, tree farm licenses, for those who don't know. An important part of this process is staying current in the rapidly evolving carbon offset markets, the development of new protocols and methodologies, and identifying real barriers to implementation of carbon offset management in our forests. Understanding the relationship between extended rotations and improving timber grades and increasing values is an important aspect in Ecotrust's work. Neil worked extensively with Ministry of Forests and Environmental Organizations Working Group in late 2009 on helping formulate the list of forest activities that should be considered for inclusion in the provincial forest carbon offset strategy. So I'll pass it over to Neil Hughes now.
Great. Thank you very much, Jaime, for that excellent introduction, and thank you to Brian and Brad came before me. They were really interesting presentations. So as Jaime said, I'm the Program Director for Forestry at Ecotrust Canada, and we've been working on forest carbon and forest carbon issues for a number of years to see what role they can play in basically diversifying the forest management opportunities here on both Crown land and private land. So just very briefly, Ecotrust Canada, we're a what we call an enterprising non-profit whose purpose is to build a conservation economy. My presentation today is about Clayoquot Sound, and Clayoquot has been right at the center of Ecotrust's operations since day one. We've been there since 1994 at the height of the environmental protests and unrest. And we believe in triple bottom line approaches to land management and this conservation economy that we talk about, providing meaningful work and good livelihoods, but must support vibrant communities at the same time, and the recognition of Aboriginal rights and title, while at the same time conserving and restoring the environment. So today I'd like to try and get 3 points delivered to you. The first of which, I just want to say that this presentation will not focus on protocols and regulations, the technical details really. I just want to instead consider why carbon might be a tool to help deal with contentious land use management issues, or make good economic sense. And so through the presentation, I'd like to just give you a little bit about the context of Clayoquot Sound and why there's a need to consider alternative land management. And then I'll try and build the case for carbon management and some of the early work that we did to understand possibilities in the region. And thirdly, creating a carbon program in Clayoquot Sound. What's the objective for doing this, and where do things stand right now? So this project is being carried out by the Clayoquot Forest Communities Program, really, which is a 5-year partnership between 5 First Nations in Clayoquot Sound and Ecotrust Canada, with the objective being of diversifying and integrating the forest industry within the region. And so specifically this carbon project we're talking about today is it's a partnership with the Hughes First Nation, the Heshquit First Nation, and the Clayoquot First Nation, who collectively have the 2 tree farm licenses that are in Clayoquot Sound within their traditional territories. Now, just for those of you who are spread out and around the country, Clayoquot Sound, as you may or may not know, is on the extreme southwest corner of British Columbia on Vancouver Island. It's the area outlined in purple on the map that you can see, which is Clayoquot Sound. That's the watershed boundary. And to say the three nations live within this area. The Tlaoquiet Nation are to the south around Tofino and Kennedy Lake. The Ahousaht Nation are really underneath the label there, Clayoquot Sound. They occupy the center part of Clayoquot Sound. And the Heshquet First Nation are up to the north. Only one of the two Tlaoquiet villages is accessible by roads in and around Tofino, and all the others, the Ahousaht, Heshquet, and the other First Nation, the other village of Tlaoquiet, Pitset, are only accessible by boat. Heshquet, up in the north, it's about an hour and a quarter ride by water taxi. So these are fairly isolated communities, even by British Columbian standards. And so, what most of you probably will know Clayoquot Sound for are the environmental protests which took place there in the early 1990s, and they were instrumental in creating a new approach to forestry, not just locally on the coast, but throughout the province, because it really resulted in the introduction of our new Forest Practices Code Act in 1996, which fundamentally changed the way forestry is carried out in BC. So following the initial court injunction that was placed against harvesting on Mears Island, the motivation from that act led to tens of thousands of protesters converging on the area to join with many of the local First Nation people and non-First Nations to demonstrate against harvesting elsewhere in the Sound. They even took the demonstrations to Victoria, and not surprisingly, very quickly became a worldwide phenomenon. I was in Scotland at the time, and it was on the news there on a almost weekly basis. And so, since 1995, though, Clayoquot Sound has become recognized as a global epicenter for its commitment to reconciling ecological, social, and economic goals. The government of the day, back in 95, then led by the Premier, Mike Harcourt, took the step of forming the Clayoquot Sound Scientific Panel and also the Central Region Board in an effort to try and set up a new way to manage the forest resources of the region. The Clayoquot Sound Scientific Panel was informed by a mix of Indigenous and scientific knowledge, with some local First Nation elders sitting on it, academics from around the province, and some people from industry. And they were attempting to design this new approach to forestry, which has now morphed into something that here in coastal BC we call ecosystem-based management. And the Central Region Board was the first attempt at shared decision-making process for land management. The Science Panel designed the first approach, as I say, to coastal harvesting, where the starting point was considering what needs to be retained on the land base to ensure ecosystem function is maintained, and then decide what is left over for timber harvesting. This resulted in a series of 11 watershed plans that have covered the majority of the land base and defined protected areas and those where harvesting under new restrictions may occur. As a result of this, about 60% of the forest is now reserved from timber harvesting. And not surprisingly, that's created a big impact on the amount of timber being harvested. Back in the late 1980s, it was up at around 900,000 cubic meters a year, so nearly 1 million cubic meters a year being harvested from the region. This dropped to 600,000 by 1993 as a result of the first legal restrictions, and now it's down at around 240,000 cubic meters following the implementation of the watershed plan. So a drastic change in the land base. We've gone from 1 million to just under, almost 1 million to just under 250,000 cubic meters a year being harvested in the region. However, even with these big changes, a big issue in the region remains is that the environmental groups who have not accepted the watershed plans, saying that the 60% of the land base that's now protected, it doesn't necessarily cover the right areas. In fact, they have a memorandum of understanding that they signed with the nations back in 1999, which agreed that there wouldn't be harvesting in the intact valleys, so those valleys where no harvesting had so far taken place. And it's that disagreement that that is a driving process behind trying to renew or build